If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for middle grade and young adult stories, spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
So on today's episode, Valerie pitched The Matrix so that we can study the hero's gift expressed. This 1999 film was written and directed by the Wachowskis. And of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And we'd love it if you give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll down to the bottom. It's that simple.
Alrighty, The Matrix. For the genre, I think it's an action story. And with the subgenre of epic, subgenre of savior. And for the secondary genre, I'm calling it a status, either sentimental or admiration. I didn't drill down enough to really come up with a decision on whether it was sentimental or admiration, but a status story. What about you, Melanie?
Oh, so I've got slightly different ones. For the global genre, I've got action epic. And then I put person against the state. And I have a feeling I put that probably because I was focused on the forces of antagonism. So, but that's interesting, right? So that's where I was honing in. And then that's influenced my choice of the subgenre. And for the secondary genre, I had worldview maturation because I had Neo's view ends with a right level of sophistication. And also his take on the massive task of saving the world. But I think either, I can see why you've picked slightly different, a status one as the secondary genre.
I kind of like it when we disagree about the genres. It's more fun. But either way, we agree it's an action story, right?
Yes, and that's probably the one that we both need to get pretty right.
Exactly. That's the main point of it. Okay, so this season I am discussing the hero's gift expressed, but as always, I have a little detour to take first, a little side note before I dive into the hero's gift expressed. One of the principles of storytelling is that right out of the gate, we as the writer, we got to give away the whole story. Now, this is a concept that can and will mess with your head if you let it. And without an example, it's almost impossible to believe. It just doesn't sound logical. It doesn't sound right. And it sounds contrary to, about a dozen other storytelling principles. But when you understand the concept, you'll start to see it all over the place. And it's really cool. It's not easy to pull off. It's not something you're going to do on a first draft. It's the kind of thing you put into your story after the whole thing is written and you go back and add it to, the first chapter or the first couple of chapters of your book or the first scene or first couple of scenes of your film. But it's in The Matrix. It's in Gone Girl too. I happened to notice that this past week. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, this might be a good topic for me to dive into in season 3. I don't know. We'll see. It's a note to self for next season. So let me talk about it very quickly in terms of The Matrix. In this movie, the whole story is actually summed up in a couple of lines of dialogue. And this happens at about 8 minutes, 45 seconds into the story. That's a rough timing. It's Neo's first scene. And this comes when there's a knock on his apartment door. And he opens the door and gives the guy a disc. And there's a guy and a girl, the girl with the white rabbit and a couple other people out there. Here's the dialogue. So I didn't look up the guy's name. I can't remember. So I'll just call him the guy. He says, "You're my savior, man. My own personal Jesus Christ." And then Neo says, "If anything happens," and the guy finishes, you don't exist. And then Neo's final line is, ever have that feeling where you're not sure if you're awake or still dreaming? So these are 3 little exchanges. You're my savior, my own personal Jesus Christ. If anything happens, you don't exist. Ever have that feeling where you're not sure if you're awake or still dreaming? That's kind of the whole Matrix. That's the whole story in a nutshell. It telegraphs to the viewer what you're going to get for the next 2 hours. Pretty neat, right?
Yeah, that is pretty neat. And I just want to take that a little bit further. So I've got a question for you. Could we say that if this is missing then in the first few pages of a book or the scenes of a movie, then would you say that's a red flag or not?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's probably not as elevated. The writing is not as elevated, but it doesn't mean that the whole story is not going to work. See, this is a funny bit because people like me keep saying, hold back, don't give the reader too much, make them work for it. Only answer the question when they need to know the answer. And yes, all that is true. However, when you give it all away like this at the beginning of the story, what happens is that it's setting up your reader's expectations for the story. So the beginning of the story, it's like, remember in grade school when you were taught to write the well-structured 5-paragraph essay? Okay, so that well-structured 5-paragraph essay is exactly what we use for novels and screenplays, by the way. So first, you tell them what you're going to tell them. That's the introduction. And then you tell them all the stuff. And then in the end, you repeat, here's what I just told you. So that's what we're doing in a novel or a film. The beginning is all about, this is the story I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you a story about this guy, Neo, who is the savior of the world. And the world we live in is this matrix. And none of us know if what is around us is real, if that's reality, or if it's a dream, or what's happening. That's what's happening here. And if you look at Gone Girl, I think it's like the 3rd or 4th page of the first chapter. It's all there. It is all there. So I happened to notice this in The Matrix because I noticed it in Gone Girl a few days ago when I was looking for something else in the book. And I came across it. And then when I watched The Matrix, I said, oh, look, there it is. Perfect. So I just wanted to highlight that to draw your attention to the fact that this is a thing. And when you know it's a thing, when you know it exists, as you start to consume stories, as you read novels or watch movies, you can keep an eye out for it and see if you can notice it. All righty. So this week's topic is The Gift Expressed. Now, The Matrix is a story about the chosen one. Just like the guy at the door said, you're my own personal Jesus Christ. Well, that's the story, the chosen one. That's exactly the story we're going to get. And the chosen one is kind of a fun twist on the hero's gift and how it's expressed. Now, if you remember episode 1 of this season, Legally Blonde, you'll know that the gift is initially expressed in about the first 10 minutes of the story. If you can do it in the first 5, better still. And then it's reinforced throughout the story, and it's fully expressed in the climax of the story. Great. The hero knows that they can do something that others can't, but they don't necessarily see it as a gift. They're not necessarily aware that the thing that they can do is somehow special or different than the other people in their world. But another character in their world, possibly the mentor, possibly an ally like a best friend or the girls in the sorority, or the antagonist even, could be the one to recognize it as a gift. And those who recognize it as a gift are actually the ones to help the hero express it. All right, so far so good. Now, in a chosen one story, however, this is where it gets interesting. Like The Matrix, like Harry Potter is another example, and there's 100 other ones that we can talk about. The hero does not think that he is special. He's told he's special, but he doesn't believe it, and he's not necessarily comfortable with that level of expectation. Now, chances are most of the other characters in the world don't think he's special either. This is really different than what we've seen so far, where other characters have recognized that Jess can play soccer really well, or that Elle knows more about fashion and beauty than anybody else. Here, the characters are looking at Neo and saying, oh yeah? You think you're all that in a bag of chips? No. Who are you, dude? Like, are you really special? We're told you're the chosen one, but like, we're not seeing any evidence of it. That's really important. So we do know that Neo is good with computers, for sure. We see that right in the very first scene. And then it's quickly followed up with a comment that when he's late for work, a comment that he works at the or one of the top software companies in the country. So he is better than the average bear, 100%. But he's not the best. Trinity is better than Neo, and they both know it. She's the one who hacked into the government system. He didn't. And she's the one who found Morpheus first. He didn't find Morpheus first. In fact, Morpheus found him. So in the Matrix, Neo's gift isn't obvious. And that's why we're not sure if he's actually gifted. If the characters in the world aren't sure he's gifted, then the audience isn't sure if he's gifted, even though he's the title character or the main character. And, you know, it's Keanu Reeves. It's not stated explicitly and overtly, but there's lots of subtle references to it. And I did make a list at some point, or when I was doing my research. But once again, I ditched the list because it would have been a really boring laundry list for you to listen to. But I do have some examples here. All right, here they are. The agents repeat the idea that Neo is living two lives. They call him Thomas Anderson. Morpheus calls him Neo and refers to him as the chosen one a whole bunch of times. The crew talk about whether he's the chosen one too, and they're discussing it amongst themselves. Do you think he is? I don't know. Do you think he is? I don't know. Notably, Trinity remains unconvinced until the very end. I'll get to that later. At about the 27-minute mark, just before the story transitions into the middle build, Morpheus says that Neo knows the Matrix exists and that he's known it his whole life, although he can't explain what it is or how he knows about it. This is the choose a pill scene. When he is within the Matrix, Neo is much faster than the average person immediately. That first time that he goes into the Matrix and does all his martial arts, kung fu stuff, the crew comments on how fast he is. That's how we know that he is different than most people who have gone into the Matrix, because the crew is impressed. And Morpheus goes in and battles him right away. That's also different, and we know that's different because of the way the crew reacts to it. Cypher says that if Neo is the chosen one, a miracle will happen to keep him from killing Neo. And that's when Tank comes back from the dead, because he's just been shot and we assume he's dead. But as soon as Cypher says that, dun dun dun, Tank stands up from behind a pillar, and he happens to have this big honking gun, and he then blasts Cypher, and Neo is saved. Hooray. So while there are these suggestions that Neo is special, there are just as many examples of Neo not being special. So there's a suspicion that he's the chosen one. He's certainly got some skills, but so far he's nothing to write home about. So here's a couple of ideas of how he's just a regular guy. Well, first of all, Neo keeps saying, I'm just a regular guy. We see Neo fail to make the jump. We see him really good at kung fu and the various martial arts, but then Morpheus wants him to try and make that jump from one rooftop to the next. And the crew is talking about that and how they're betting on whether he's going to do it. This happens at the point in the story when we would expect to see the first glimmer of the hero's gift, when the antagonist would expect to see the first glimmer of a gift. But it doesn't happen. Neo fails and he falls to the ground, actually goes through the ground. Even though he does that, the crew isn't ready to discount him yet or give up hope, but Trinity is still not convinced. And of course, the Oracle says that he's not the chosen one when Neo is brought to her. She has prophesied the second coming of a man who will destroy the Matrix and end the war and bring freedom to all the people, but she says to Neo, "You're not it, dude. Sorry." So this is not an exhaustive list. Like I said, I did make one, but it's a pretty boring laundry list to listen to. But you get the idea.
Do you think in stories where there are sequels that the denial of the label of the chosen one is essential? And if that's the case, then is the first stories always going to be different from the ones that succeeded?
Well, when it comes to sequels or a trilogy or a duology or a series of any kind, as writers, we might have in our mind that that's what we want to create. But the first book has got to work. It's got to be really solid in and of itself. Never mind books 2 through 25, because you're not going to get there if the first one isn't rock solid and isn't really interesting. So my best advice is just focus on that first book and make sure it's working. Sure, if you've got in the back of your mind that the story could go in a couple of different directions, you can plant some seeds in there if you want that you can then pull from in subsequent books. But the first book has to be solid in and of itself. So that's my 2 cents worth when it comes to sequels or multiple book series. Okay. And your other question was about if the chosen one doesn't have a gift, what was the rest of your question?
No, so if the chosen one, so the first story, we'll use the Matrix as an example. Neo's gift gets realized in the end. So this first one is kind of about him becoming the chosen one. And then after that, he is the chosen one. So does that mean once he's accepted it and showed that gift, that this story then is different from the ones that will follow it? And I suppose in terms of other stories that, follow the same path.
Well, kind of, yeah, for sure. But it's his origin story, right? We saw that with Captain Marvel. It's the origin story. How did Neo become Neo? It's what the whole thing is about. So no, I haven't seen any of the other Matrix movies. So I'm just going to speak in general terms here. But when the second movie comes out or the second book comes out, the reader comes to page 1 with a character who is already empowered, right? So the gift is well entrenched. The hero knows about it. Everybody else in the world knows about it too. They've already proven themselves. So if we think of a superhero movie, what happens in the second movie is that a new villain shows up and now they have to thwart this new villain. And so maybe their gift is tested even more and they get to express it even more and they get to develop it, but they haven't got to prove that they have it because they've already done that. That was what the first thing was all about. So for most of the Matrix, like we just said, we're kind of wondering if Neo has this gift or not. But he does, and it does get expressed. It is no surprise in a chosen one story that the writers have kept us guessing about Neo's gift, because that's, like we said, that's an origin story. That's kind of what we're here for, to see how that all comes to pass. It's also no surprise that Neo's gift comes to the surface in the ending payoff. It's in the final act of the story. In fact, it's like the last 20 minutes of the story. It just cooks. It's so much fun. So it's about an hour and 46 minutes into the movie. This is when we get the first real glimpse of Neo's gift. And it's when they're on the rooftop, he and Trinity and the agents, and Neo is bending backwards away from the bullets. And in case we're in any doubt that this is special, Trinity tells us. She just comes right out and says, "Oh, I've never seen anyone do that before." So with all her experience, because she is the not the commanding officer, but the ranking officer she's the 2IC on that ship, therefore is the most experienced behind Morpheus. So with all that experience and knowledge, and she's never seen anyone do what Neo has done there, he's special. He's fancy. A couple of minutes later, they're back on the ship, and Tank proclaims that he knows in his heart that now Neo is the chosen one. And they have a whole discussion of the Oracle and what the Oracle said. And Neo himself says that, "Now I believe I'm the chosen one." I mean, you can only say that in a movie. I mean, you can't go around in life claiming, I am the best writer. I am the chosen writer. I wouldn't recommend that.
Only if you're a 5-year-old in a cape with your underpants on the outside would you get away.
That's right. That's right. Beyond that, humility is a good thing. So even though he says that he believes he's now the chosen one, his gifts fully haven't expressed. Then we move on to that famous subway scene, right? This is where Neo is going head to head with the agent. And what we have here is a battle between humanity and artificial intelligence. I do feel like I'm in the Matrix sometimes, I have to say. And AI, although there's benefits, it's mostly starting to scare me to death. So I'm hoping we have a Neo to come and save us. That's what I'm hoping. And this battle between Neo and the agent, I mean, we have been waiting nearly 2 hours for this. And it does not disappoint. That is a very satisfying battle. And in the Matrix, there's lots of great special effects and there's lots of spectacle, 100%. But I think spectacle is being used here to enhance the storytelling. It's not eclipsing the storytelling like it does in, say, Dune or Rogue One. And it's in this scene where Neo claims his name. The agent calls him Mr. Anderson. And he says, "My name is Neo." And this is the beginning of the ending sequence, right? So from this point forward, you're just rocking and rolling right to the end. The next step in his gift being expressed is a demonstration that his power is increasing and getting really good really fast. This is when the agents shoot him a whole bunch of times and he sort of splats against the wall and falls to the ground. And he does flatline, but then he comes back to life. So the agent's bullets do not kill him. For anybody else, that would do them in, because you can die in the Matrix. Okay, so this is the only part of the movie that kind of bothers me, because the way he comes back to life is that, of course, Trinity declares her love for him and she kisses him and he wakes up and whatever. This movie is really innovative. And I remember when it came out, everybody was talking about it. But this, having Trinity, who is otherwise a very strong, amazing woman, her big thing in the movie is to declare that she loves him and bring him back to life with a kiss, love's first kiss or some foolishness. That is a cliche. And I think this movie is too good to have relied on a tired old cliche like that. I think they could have gotten that point across in a very different way, a more innovative way, because the Wachowskis are more than capable of innovating. I'm being picky. It's the one thing in an otherwise amazing story. Could I have written this? No. So, I'll get off my soapbox now. And the other thing too is that this is a really important convention of a chosen one story, right? He is the Jesus Christ of the story, as we were told right off the bat. So what then has to happen? He has to die and be resurrected. So that is, that's a convention, right? So finally, around 2 hours and 5 minutes, this is the big final scene where Neo's gift is fully expressed. There is no doubt in anybody's mind now that this guy is different. And this is when the agents shoot him and there's this wall of bullets coming toward him. And he can put up his hand and stop them. And he can pluck a bullet out of the air and the other ones just fall down. And again, in case we missed it, Morpheus tells us, he declares, "Ta-da, see, I told you all, he is the chosen one." I'm being a bit facetious, but he does say, "See, I told you so. He is the chosen one." At this point, Neo has fully integrated with the Matrix. He can navigate it as well or better than the agents. He flies into the agents and destroys them. And he also puts AI on notice, the antagonist, right? The main antagonist, the artificial intelligence. He puts them on notice. But Listen, don't take my word for it. If you are writing a chosen one story, my best recommendation to you is to go find a whole bunch of other examples of chosen one stories and study them and see if they are handling or if they're approaching the hero's gift expressed in the same way that is it's being expressed in The Matrix, in Harry Potter, in those are the only two that are on the top of my mind right now, but I know there's a bunch of them. This is not a different type of story. We've seen this a lot. And look to see what the conventions are. What do these stories have in common? What are their protagonists like? Who believes that they're the chosen one? Who doesn't? When does that show up? Another convention, I kind of touched on this already. In order for the gift to be fully realized, the chosen one, the hero, has to sacrifice themselves, right? It's another convention of a chosen one story because, like we said off the top, this is the story of Jesus. So if you know the story of Jesus Christ, you'll know the conventions. The oracle says that he and Morpheus, they can't both live. So when it looks like Morpheus is going to sacrifice himself to protect Neo, then Neo springs into action, right? He makes the selfless decision to go and save Morpheus. And in doing so, he steps into his power. So in that regard, it kind of makes me think of Captain Marvel, where the human character had to make a human decision or had to have a human trait in order for the superpower to manifest. So it's kind of the same thing. It's not exactly one-to-one because this is not a superhero movie like Captain Marvel is an obvious superhero movie, but it's in the ballpark. How about that? What do you think of that, Melanie?
Well, I think as we go into some of these sub genres, especially ones that are popular and extremely well known, like chosen ones, that we're kind of uncovering some of those conventions that are particular to those stories, and I find that really interesting. So, what you've just said, we could probably come up with a bit more of a list of the chosen one conventions. What do you think?
Yeah, we definitely could if we wanted to. Like I said, get a bunch of them and study them. It's not high on my list of things to do right now. I have a novel to finish, but it can be done.
Yeah, no, I think, but uncovering it, right, is the first thing. So bringing it out and becoming aware of it is the first thing. And you've got some really good points there about those conventions and unconscious expectations that we have. Because I would say that, the story of Jesus Christ is probably, especially in Western culture, extremely well known. And there's probably things in there that you just inherently know if you've been brought up in a Christian-based society. So it's, and until you mentioned it, it's like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. But yes, you're right. We both have other things that we need to get on and do. So, and
you have a book to finish too.
Yes, I do. I've got two to do. Nothing like oversubscribing yourself to get you motivated. All right. So the forces of antagonism in this story. So I have picked this week. There's a couple of different forces of antagonism, but the main one that we see, and it's very obvious, is corrupt entities. Well, that's what I'm calling corrupt entities. So, but there also is an interesting combination, and I'll go through them all and what I think and how they play out, because I found this really interesting, and I was surprised at how interesting the forces of antagonism were in this movie. So the main force of antagonism, as I mentioned, I think is a corrupt entity, with the agents personifying the villainous nature of the antagonist, which is the artificial intelligence, and that's a singular consciousness that spawned a race of machines, and the machines use humans as a source of energy. So the humans are batteries, and that's sort of what we actually see that in the movie. And then the matrix are used to keep the humans under control so that they can live, and just by living in the red goopy fluid, provide energy for the machines to run. So this is like Captain Marvel, where the Kree were agents of the Supreme Intelligence. So the agents are visually humanoids in the Matrix, but they really are sentient programs in the artificial world. The machines also have a physical hunt and kill robot or number of robots that search the rebels in the real world. So that's how we see the forces of antagonism from the artificial intelligence manifest. Now, there are some other, like I mentioned, smaller but interesting forces of antagonism in this movie. Plus, I think, one antagonistic problem, but I'll deal with that problem at the end. So I'll keep you guessing as to what that is. So I'm not sure if I've provided the definition of the forces of antagonism that I'm using this season, but I'll provide it here so I'll make it clear, because I come back to this as I explore some of the more minor forces of antagonism. An antagonist or a force of antagonism is someone or something that challenges the protagonist. And I like this definition because it uses the concept of challenge, which means that the force of antagonism can be positive as well as negative. Right, so the Matrix also has a shapeshifter or a trickster who does some of the work of the corrupt entity. So Cypher starts out as an ally, as one of the Nebuchadnezzar's crew, but he's very discontent, and his ruminations culminate in a scene where he does a deal with Agent Smith to return to the Matrix in exchange for Morpheus. So the trickster is an archetype in storytelling theory. And in the book Anatomy of Story by Truby, he defines a trickster as someone who uses confidence, trickery, and a way with words to get what they want. However, they may also become a complete liar who only looks out for themselves. And Cypher is definitely looking out for himself, and this is his undoing. But by selling out the crew, he performs a critical function in the story and in Neo's character arc. The Oracle is also an antagonist. We saw positive forces of antagonism in Bend It Like Beckham and Captain Marvel, and I believe the Oracle is a positive antagonist because she puts the challenge to Neo, or a challenge to Neo. She understands what Neo needs to become the One, and she puts that choice in the front of Neo's mind. And so when Neo is forced to make the choice to save Morpheus or let him die, he steps into the story and is on the path of becoming the One. The Oracle has also worked her magic with Orpheus and with Trinity. So she isn't only working through Neo, she sets up an obstacle of expectation. And anyone who's had to live up to someone else's expectation will know how this can either stifle you or force you to grow depending on your alignment or investment in that expectation. So Neo doesn't really care about being the One, but he does care about Morpheus and the crew of the Nebuchadnezzar. And she knows this, and therefore when she puts the obstacle in his way, she probably knows the decision that he's going to make in the story, and that's what he needs to become the One. I haven't discussed archetypes, especially the shadow archetype in this season, even though forces of antagonism is my topic of discussion. And I haven't done this primarily because there's a lot of information about archetypes readily available for writers. I'm also concluding that if we only look at the shadow archetype as the force of antagonism for the protagonist, we are missing out on other techniques and other forces of antagonism that provide us with options as writers. Now, Morpheus is a force of antagonism for Neo. His belief that Neo is the One challenges Neo, and rightly so. It's a burden because the One must transform to save all of humankind. So it's an existential burden and an existential question for Neo. However, for most of the movie, Morpheus has enough belief about Neo being the One for both of them.
Okay, so this is interesting. I saw Morpheus as the mentor and not an antagonist. So do you think that he is fulfilling both roles? Because the archetypes are roles, they're not characters. Sometimes one character plays one role and it doesn't change throughout the whole story. other times one character sort of moves in and out of various archetypes. There's a whole bunch of shapeshifters, in other words. So do you think that Morpheus is also a mentor? So a mentor and antagonist, or do you think he's sort of staying in that antagonistic role?
No, so I think he's both. And I think this is where it's interesting to look at positive forces of antagonism as well. And to me, that makes sense that Morpheus, as a mentor, is trying to elevate the protagonist, in Neo in this case. So they have to challenge the protagonist to be more than what they are at the beginning of the movie. So I suppose I'm just expanding that view of what a force of antagonism is and looking at how other archetypes like a mentor are antagonists. So in that they challenge the protagonist, and whether that's a positive or in a negative way. So I do see absolutely Morpheus as the mentor, but I think he uses the challenge and is a force of antagonism for Neo. So he's doing both at the same time. He's just, I don't think, the shadow. And the shadow is really that negative force of antagonism, whereas Morpheus never delves into becoming the shadow, but he does challenge. And so that's why I provided the definition of what antagonism was. And I like the use of the word challenge as opposed to just, a bad character or influencing the character in a negative way. He's actually, instead of shutting Neo down, he's trying to open him up. And that's still difficult. That's change. And that's still difficult and challenging for characters in our stories. So does that, does that answer? Does that make sense that you can, as even those more positive archetypes like the mentor can use or be considered a force of antagonism in a story?
Yes, I think it's a good answer. And if we think about how a story works, if you've got a scene with just two characters in it, one of them is the protagonist and then it's somebody else. That somebody else by default becomes the antagonist of the scene because there has to be conflict in a scene. So it's entirely possible that a character who is not globally an antagonist, it could be the character's best friend. So it's globally, they're an ally. But in that moment in the story, in that scene in the story, they're an antagonist. They're antagonistic to the protagonist in order to create conflict in the scene so that you have a working scene, so that you have a working story. Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Sorry. Good. Carry on.
No, that's good. That's because that's a point that really sort of became clear for me while I was watching this movie. And as I thought about how the forces of antagonism force Neo to realize his gift. And I do really like that those two areas that we're studying do come together in this movie, and I can now see it in more stories as we're analysing. So that's a really, really good question. All right. So while I was thinking about Morpheus, his role in the movie and his belief that Neo is the one, it prompted another thread of thought for me this week. So if a story is about the chosen one, then the forces of antagonism must bring the force of an existential crisis right to the feet of the protagonist. So the stakes are not just about life and death of the character in the story. It's about life as we know it. And it's about the valuable things the things that we hold valuable in that life. Now, when I say it out loud, it really seems obvious, but perhaps it's not. So this is just an idea. A chosen one exists in the content genre of action or person against the state or savior, but it operates on a higher level than life and death. So it must have a force of antagonism that threatens to destroy life as we know it. So that's I'll just put that out there and leave that hanging, because that fits into the question I asked Valerie before about, are these sort of conventions that we're now pulling out about some of these sub-genres? And that was just one that came to mind this week. All right, so how did the forces of antagonism drive the story in The Matrix forward? Well, so usually the forces of antagonism drive the story forward by opposing the protagonist's want. So what does Neo want? Well, I am not sure. So Morpheus's need is very clear. He wants Neo so Neo can take down the Matrix from the inside. The machines and the agents don't know that Neo is considered the one, and Cypher doesn't tell Agent Smith when they strike their deal about Neo or the prophecy. So the primary forces of antagonism's want is not specifically about Neo. It's about Zion and those who have escaped from the Matrix energy farm. So the machines, the agents, and the hunt and kill robots don't want free humans roaming around Earth. Morpheus has the codes for Zion and becomes the target, especially of Agent Smith. So killing the rebels and capturing Morpheus in either the Matrix or the real world does drive the story forward. The expectation and confirmation of Neo as the one drive Morpheus's actions, which places the crew of the Nebuchadnezzar in danger. And it also places them in the path of the agents, or puts them in the sights of the agents. So the agents are increasingly called upon to use their ability to manipulate the Matrix. Their power is revealed gradually in the movie. They can morph into anyone and be in any place. They can manipulate human avatars and remove their mouths. They can also defy gravity and slow and speed up time. Eventually, Neo must be able to do the same as the agents, but then go further to defeat them. So what impact do the forces of antagonism have on the protagonist? Well, the greater the force of antagonism, the greater the protagonist's response must be, so that they can overcome the obstacles and reach their full potential. But the Matrix doesn't quite do this. The forces of antagonism is not directed at Neo, but the power differential between them is very great. As one member of a group, he is a target, but he's not the target. It's Morpheus. And by putting Morpheus's life in danger, this is where Neo must make the choice that then leads him into the situation where he does meet Orpheus's expectations. Therefore, Neo needs to believe and then become the one. So the harder someone struggles, the greater the victory. And Neo's mental struggle is greater than his physical struggle, because the physical struggle in the Matrix is not real. He's programmed to acquire certain skills. However, it's still life and death, because in the Matrix, you can still die. The harder someone has to struggle, the greater the victory. So Neo's mental struggle is greater than his physical struggle, because the physical struggle in the Matrix is not real. He's programmed to acquire certain skills. However, it's still life and death, because death in the Matrix is death in the outside world as well. So the forces of antagonism must also embody the protagonist's fears. Even if they are unconscious fears, they must also attack the protagonist's weaknesses. And again, this is where the hero's gift must be brought out by the forces of antagonism. And all of the forces of antagonism lead to the climactic point in this movie. We see constructive and destructive forces of antagonism working together to force Neo to level up. Morpheus' belief that Neo is the one plants that idea in Neo. The Oracle doesn't confirm or deny if Neo is the one. Instead, she tells him about a decision he must make. And it's the right amount of information to get Neo where he needs to be. Cypher, as the shapeshifter or trickster, sets up the capture of Morpheus, thus putting Neo in the situation where the Oracle's prediction is realized. And as an aside, this does a couple of things. It supports the Oracle's predictions for Trinity and Morpheus, both of which center around Neo being the one. So it's a really actually very clever way the Wachowskis have written this and have really used the forces of antagonism to reach that climactic point. Now, if the agents didn't take Morpheus and Neo didn't fight the agents in the train station, then he wouldn't have been taken to the point where he could see the code and manipulate it. So again, this is a really brilliant example of how to use forces of antagonism to bring the story to a head. Did the forces of antagonism have their own logic and rationale for their actions? Well, absolutely. The forces of antagonism are there to protect the Matrix and ensure that they quash any threats to the way the Matrix operates. They are also there to exterminate free humans and preserve the ignorance of humans who provide the power to the artificial intelligence. And interestingly, Agent Smith's want is even more specific than the general artificial intelligences. Agent Smith hates being in the Matrix. He would not have to be in the Matrix if free humans didn't exist. And this is why he wants to destroy Zion, because he wants to leave the Matrix. And he makes that very clear to Morpheus. It's a really interesting, he kind of acts out on his own, which is really interesting. And it almost brings his character, it realizes his character in a way that the other agents aren't realized. So I found that pretty interesting. So how do the forces of antagonism meet the expectation of the genre or serve the genre of the story? The forces of antagonism arrive very early, although we don't quite know who's good or bad at the beginning of the story. And although the men in suits don't have the bald in my 4Bs, which I put forward in our episode on June, which was big bald boys who wear black, they also channel the intent of this stereotype by the suits and the way they appear and their sunglasses at night. There is also quite a bit of world building that takes place, with Morpheus and the crew explaining the free world and the history of how humans become batteries for the machines. But I would argue that it's also necessary for a science fiction story like this. But unlike other science fiction stories we've covered, this world is new to Neo, our protagonist, and we are finding out the rules at the same time he is. And that's really important. So we are traveling that journey of this new world with Neo, and we haven't seen that in the other science fiction movies that we've studied to this point. And I think it's really well done, and I think it actually justifies a level of exposition and explanation as to what's going on. All right, so what's the gap between the wants and the needs of the protagonist, and how does the antagonist get in the way? And how is the antagonist then defeated and subdued? So this is where we come to the antagonistic problem. This is the first of a trilogy, and some of what I'm going to say may be a bit unfair because it is the first of the story, but it's worth highlighting. The antagonist's wants are meant to put them on a collision path with the protagonist. So Neo doesn't know exactly what he wants for most of the movie, right up until Morpheus is taken. So this could be a convention for a chosen one story, especially if the chosen one doesn't believe or doesn't want to be the chosen one. So the machines want the code to the Zion mainframe to destroy all the rebels. However, Neo has no connection with Zion or understanding of what Zion is. So this movie doesn't completely put Neo and the machines against each other. This movie is about Neo becoming the chosen one. And like we saw in Captain Marvel, the first battle is won, but the war rages on.
And that brings us to today's action step. All right, so this week, what I want you to do is look for other examples of a chosen one protagonist. They pop up in fantasy stories quite often, and I'm sure in science fiction they pop up there as well. But I want you to look outside of fantasy and sci-fi and see if that type of protagonist pops up in other genres. I honestly don't know the answer. I'm sure they do, but I can't think of an example. So if you find an example, let me know. contact me on social media, Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. I'd love to hear it.
All right, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Promising Young Woman. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find more out about me, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit me on Facebook, Melanie Hill, under Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.